Turkish Airlines presents Business Africa.
Hello and welcome to Business Africa with me, Ronald Ketop. This week, after securing IMF financing, Ghana's leaders crashed their heads over how to convince lenders to restructure billions of dollars in debt. Having borrowed excessively from private creditors who want to be repaid in full, the country faces a tough road ahead in its quest for debt relief. Plus, after dropping it in 2019, pressure is growing on Zimbabwe to reintroduce the US dollar as inflation and high interest rates bog down its local currency. The greenback is already the de facto official currency in Zimbabwe, with up to 77% of all transactions settled in the dollar in the first quarter of 2023. Also, what more can the private sector do to support the African Continental Free Trade Area? We bring you thoughts of Africa's key business leaders, investors, and policymakers meeting in Abidjan. Stay with us for the details. Thank you for joining us. Ghana has had to run to the IMF 17 times since independence. That's roughly once every 4 years on average. This time, though, securing a bailout package from the multilateral lender was the easier part. There's still a ton of work for Ghana's leaders to do to convince creditors to provide over $22 billion in debt relief, not least because a significant chunk of Accra's external debt is held by private lenders who want all their money back.
The IMF has disbursed $600 million, the first tranche of a $3 billion bailout loan to help Ghana stabilize its finances. According to Accra, the funds will be used to shore up the country's foreign currency reserves and to help protect the city from further depreciation. The West African country's attention now turns to convincing its external lenders to restructure up to $22 billion of its debt. Accra's creditors are diverse with conflicting interests. 76% of Ghana's external debt is held by private lenders, including bondholders. Multilateral Development Bank also hold a significant chunk of Ghana's debt, followed by the Paris Club and China. That Ghana defaulted on repayment has made reaching an agreement on debt relief even harder, with bondholders especially hesitant to give any concessions, not to mention the geopolitization of debt. Ghana must also navigate tough IMF conditionalities, which include government spending cuts and higher fuel and electricity tariffs, causing even more hardship for families already struggling with high inflation.
Professor Theophilus Achampong is an economist and a visiting senior fellow at the Africa Policy Research Institute. Thank you very much, sir, for your time. Ghana's lenders are quite diverse. What are they asking for, and what is Accra willing to give?
And what Ghana wants to do is, over the course of the next 3-4 years under the IMF program, get as much as $10.5 billion of relief coming from the creditors. So more than half of the $20 billion that is looking to restructure the external debt is what is looking to get from them. And that translates to about $2.6 billion USD every year that Ghana hopes to get in the form of relief or reprieve from these creditors.
Can Ghana get a favorable deal under the current conditions? Will the country actually save any money from restructuring its debt?
It's going to be a bit difficult, and I have kind of highlighted this earlier because we've seen similar instances with the likes of Zambia, but there's been major contestations around how we treat certain creditor groups, number one. But number two, in Ghana's case especially, you've got these massive Eurobonds, the commercial debt, that you've got to address. So I think the road ahead is going to be quite challenging in the sense that all the $2.6 billion that they need to get every year, it probably might not, amount to that. And this is just on the basis of some of the evidence we've seen with other countries that have attempted to go down this route.
As you said, the biggest percentage of the external debt that Ghana seeks to restructure is held by commercial creditors. Just how much does that complicate any chances of reaching a deal soon?
Yes, it does make it quite hard, largely because, again, most of these commercial creditors have fiduciary obligations to their shareholders, but also because Ghana is already, in a way, defaulted on making the interest payment on a number of these debt obligations since December of last year. It does make the process rather much more complicated. And, Ghana has already indicated that they're looking at haircuts of about, 30 to 50%. I think that's going to be a big pill to swallow for a number of these commercial creditors.
Professor, Ghana has already defaulted and has no credibility left as a borrower. When it eventually decides to approach the money markets again, what will the reception be like?
If they manage to implement the structural reforms under the IMF program and put the economy on a sound footing, and if in the next couple of years we see global interest rates begin to improve and there's much more sentiment for emerging market debt, then I see the possibility of Ghana actually going back to the market to borrow. What would also help in this regard, and this is one of the key sort of conditionalities within the IMF program, is that Ghana has got to change its fiscal responsibility laws, and it's got to introduce a debt ceiling as well. So it's no longer going to be the case of just borrowing without a limit, but they would be subject to some legal checks and balances.
Professor Theophilus Acheampong, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, since 2009, Zimbabwe has adopted a range of currencies, including the US dollar, in a bid to tackle inflation. In 2019, Harare reverted to a local currency, which is now being haunted by inflation and high interest rates. Manufacturers, retailers, and suppliers all prefer to settle in the US dollar, with only a small fraction of all transactions in the country being completed in the local currency.
As the Zimbabwean dollar continues to weaken against the US dollar, lawmakers have called for the official dollarization and halting the use of the local currency, while the ordinary Zimbabwean can't afford basic commodities.
The biggest culprit is the government itself. But we need to stop having clowns. We need to stop the circus. We need to have a situation where we face reality. People are dying in hospitals. Okay. There's no medication. Civil servants are not being remunerated well. The war veterans are not even being remunerated. It's across the economy. It's important for us to stabilize the economy by using the US dollar while we are mending our own currency.
Zimbabwe has been plunged into a severe economic crisis for the past 20 years, marked by shortages of money and food.
We get paid in RTGS on our phones, so whenever we get the money, it would have lost its value because the rate would have gone up. And almost everywhere you go, people only want US dollars.
The local currency in May alone has lost more than 50% of its value. And in year-to-date terms, the currency is down more than 75%. So my advice to the government is they have to spend within our limits and also need monetary discipline from the RBZ side, where we are saying we should stop overprinting of money, which is increasing liquidity and fueling speculation and exchange rate overshoot in the economy.
The government has tried to stabilize the economy, but so far without success.
Now, the African Continental Free Trade Area is meant to increase intra-African trade and manufacturing. But to unlock the bloc's potential, local manufacturing has to tick up dramatically. Agro-processing has been identified as one of the most viable sectors. Ndea Yoka reports now from Abidjan.
The Africa CEO Forum held in Ivory Coast's Abidjan ended on Tuesday. Participants discussed the African Continental Free Trade Area project, describing it as a new era for providing African decision-makers with the tools for tackling agricultural transformation and intra-African trade. Although obstacles remain, Ivory Coast is preparing to position itself as a future economic hub. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a major asset for giving industrial companies visibility. That's why we need to invest in industrial parks to attract international and local investors, so that we can transform our raw materials and sell them across the African continent. We are preparing to make Côte d'Ivoire a hub for agribusiness and so on. In addition, the Ivorian trade minister signed 2 memorandums of understanding with private sector players, all dedicated to the development of industrial sites. With all these actions, the Ivorian government intends to contribute to the effective implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area project. According to the World Bank, it could enable African countries to lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty and create 18 million additional jobs by 2035.
And that wraps up this episode of Business Africa. I am Ronald Kato. The news continues on air and online. Bye for now, and I'll see you on the next episode of Business Africa.
Business Africa was presented by Turkish Airlines.